Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor, and I'll show you, I think, today what I've been thinking about, what I've been struggling with, to explain to you sort of how my reading life works. So, as you may know, if you've if you've been here before, the last video I made was about these two books together. And I couldn't stop thinking about The Weather by Lisa Robertson, which is a book of mostly prose poetry. And I realized that this is quite an old book, so I looked her up to see what else she's been doing lately. And lo and behold, I found out that she's been writing a novel, and it just came out recently, and my local bookstore had a copy of it. It's called the Baudelaire Fractal. And I started to read it and found it quite interesting, but quickly realized that I really need to know more about Baudelaire. To give you an idea of what it's about, this is from the back of the book. One morning, Hazel Brown awakes in a badly decorated hotel room to find that she's written the complete works of Charles Baudelaire. So here I am with hardly any knowledge of Baudelaire other than, obviously I've heard of him. And I went back to my bookstore and I found this absolutely stunning. This is, I believe, the latest translation of The Flowers of Evil. And that's just a stunning cover. But also it had a very, very thorough introduction, as far as I could tell, by Dana Gioia. And I can vouch for this introduction, which I've read meticulously. It's absolutely fantastic. So if you're new to Baudelaire, as I am, and you want to have an introduction as part of the book of The Flowers of Evil, and you just want to really immerse yourself, but quickly, this is it. Also, the translator, Aaron Puchigian, is a fascinating writer, because he himself is, I found out, a poet who loves to write in meter and rhyme. And because Baudelaire, to my surprise, wrote in meter and rhyme, I always thought of rebel poets as not doing that, but that's my ignorance. So he mostly writes the translation in meter and rhyme, and it's just a delight to read. I have tried to read Baudelaire before and found it very stodgy and boring. So I'm beginning through reading the introduction, and with this particular translation, I'm beginning to understand what this adoration of Baudelaire is all about. It's all about the context. Nowadays, poets are doing far crazier things, but at the time, this was momentous. The other thing I want to say, as I recommend this book to you, is that there is an afterword by Daniel Handler, and I quickly realized that Daniel Handler is the real name of the author Lemony Snicket. And if you've read the series yourself, or if you've had children who were addicted to the Lemony Snicket series of books about the Baudelaire the Baudelaire orphans, you'll put one and one together and realize that Daniel Handler chose to call his orphans the Baudelaire orphans for a reason. And here he explains in the afterword, which is really so lovely, that around the age of 12, he found The Flowers of Evil in the library, and he was consumed with it. And since then, he's loved it. And he has children come up to him when he goes to readings and, signings. And if it's in a library, they'll often bring him a book that they found of Baudelaire's poems and ask him if this Baudelaire is related to his orphans. And he always says, of course, absolutely, because artistically, in his mind, they are. So again, so now I've gone from being interested. So at first I was, I'm just a huge fan of Sheila Heti and I just want to think about her work. Then I'm thinking, oh, it reminds me a little bit of the weather. Then I'm thinking, oh, but Lisa Robertson wrote a novel. I'm going to read the Baudelaire Fractal. Before I even finish the first 30 pages of that, I realized I really need to know more about Baudelaire, and now I'm reading this. So you can see how crazy this week has been for me. It's been a lot, but I don't feel that I have a real grasp on on anything yet because everything is so new. Now, of course, I'm dealing with the discussion in my mind. I'm still remembering the discussion about, from my last video. And of course, I ended with the idea of possibly reading more prose poetry, finding out more about it, and talking, here about it. And I in planning to do so, it suddenly occurs to me and I have heard, the one context I've heard of Baudelaire in is a Paris spleen. And so I ration by this book because I remembered hearing that he wrote prose poetry. And so I start to read this and I think, oh, this is fantastic. And this is quite different prose poetry. And I remember having been assigned a few of these in a class one time. So now I'm sort of remembering what I've been taught as well. And my mind is all about prose poetry. So then I go to my shelf and I have this little book by Jacques Roubaud called Poetry, Etc. Cleaning House. And I had a massive poetry crush on this particular man about 10 years ago. And now not so much. I find him a bit pretentious and silly, which shows you what happens as you get older and wiser. But in any case, he does have at the end of it Section J of the novel, for example. So here he is a poet, an Oulipo poet as well. And he's talking and he always says something quite unexpected. You can always count on him to have, not to be boring. So he has a dialogue at the beginning of this section between two people. The first one says, "What is the position of poetry in literature?" The other responds, "Poetry is a ghost that haunts literature." You're avoiding the question. I'm responding with a new hypothesis that stems from the preceding ones. Hypothesis of poetry. Poetry is not literature. And then further along it says, if poetry is considered simply as a region of literature, it becomes incomprehensible, if not negligible. And funnily enough, this makes sense to me. Why does this make sense to me? Because I've been thinking about a particular video. Where are my notes? Where are my notes when I need them? Damn it. See, this what you're looking at in real time is how I work and why I need BookTube to focus on something. So, why am I thinking about literature generally? Because a day ago, an incredibly helpful video was published by Katie of Books and Things. I'll leave a link because I highly recommend that video. It's a long video that seemed to pass by in 2 seconds, 50 minutes in 2 seconds, because she's so knowledgeable, so concise, so interesting, and such a lovely personality as well. She's trying to explain in this video what she means when she talks about literary fiction. She often says about a book that was too literary for me, and she explains on a spectrum. I'm summarizing very quickly, but please do go to her video. This is her idea, which I absolutely love. On a spectrum, on one end you have commercial fiction, on the other you have literary fiction. In the middle you have book group or book club fiction, which was a revelation to me. And then everything in the middle, of course. Nothing is only one thing. And of course the genres work everywhere. So you can have genre literary fiction and genre commercial fiction. Of course you can. So she's able to speak about this without any value judgments. And there is a point to this. The point is when Jacques Roubaud says that when Jacques Roubaud says that he has this hypothesis that poetry is in literature, he's talking about something that's peculiar about poetry that makes it so much harder, so much more slippery to define. And what I had tried to do after listening to Katie from Books and Things was to apply her ideas about literary fiction compared to commercial to poetry. And I can certainly do that, but not to my absolute satisfaction. And I've been thinking about how to get away, can I use Katie's ideas to get away from this horrible, almost fixation that poets have nowadays with talking about poetry as either accessible or difficult. Those are just such horrible words to me. And I feel a sense of liberation when I think of commercial poetry as compared to literary poetry. But Roubaud is pointing out something else, and that is very hard to communicate. So what he writes here is, as part of that dialogue again, the first person says, "You would say that languages have in turn been memories of poetry." That's right. And that's a hypothesis that I would defend, not as a tale of origin, but in the contemporaneousness of languages and in the different stations of their histories. And that's something I'm really going to have to think very hard about, because it's quite a complex idea that languages are the memories of poetry. And what he's really pointing to is that when you write poetry or read poetry, there's something you're connecting with in language that's completely different from other forms of literature. You can see how I get lost in my thoughts, and then when I sit down to film something, it's a challenge. So back to this idea of Katie's. I go back 2 videos to the video I made about All Fours by Miranda July. One of the most difficult books to talk about. And I realized that actually Katie's ideas make it much easier. So if we look at All Fours by Miranda July, would you say that it's commercial fiction? Would you say that it's closer to commercial fiction, closer to literary fiction, or closer to the middle ground with book club, book group fiction? Now, it's interesting because Miranda July, I would never ever think of her ever writing anything that wasn't literary fiction, just kind of knowing about her art and about her personality, really. But I did mention, and I still hold to it, that the first 100 pages of this book read very much like non-literary fiction. There's a plot, there are characters that you are interested in. It's fast-paced. It it's well written, but the writing is serving the plot itself, and then it takes a turn, and it takes quite an extreme turn to what I think is really literary fiction. So where would a publisher, as Katie says, position this book? And so I was thinking about how interesting it is that, as part of Miranda July's art, but also as part of a possibly marketing strategy, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to hook in an audience. She starts on a particular type of, she starts with a particular type of writing, and then she moves on to that. And that reminded me, and because I'm talking about prose poetry, of course, so that reminded me of this book, which I am very, very interested in doing a deeper dive into, and I will, called Today in the Taxi by Sean Singer. And it came out recently, and I am to this day shocked that it's not talked about more, and I mean, it's not more well known, and it's not popular, and everyone's not talking about it. It's a super cool book, but it's doing something that Miranda July's book is doing. So it's a book of prose poems, and each one has a title, and each one begins with exactly the same phrase: today in the taxi, I. So it's a taxi driver talking about the different people that he picks up, mostly. The landscape he's in Manhattan generally. So the streets he's moving through and the people he's picking up. And I'll leave a link, and also a link to a couple of videos that were made as part of the publicity for this book, which again, I don't know why isn't noted more widely. But in any case, every single one of these prose poems begins in what sounds like a commercial poetry mode. So I'll give you an example, just the very first one. Today in the taxi, I brought a man from Midtown to someplace in Astoria near the airport. He asked me to take him a round trip. We got to the address, and he waited outside the place, and someone came out and handed him a brown paper bag. The man gave the person some cash. Then we left. He asked me to drive him to the E train instead. So there's 3 stanzas in this prose poem, and okay. Now that's for all intents and purposes, if we want to use these definitions, which I do from Katie, because I find it, I'm not going to say, oh, that's accessible. That's just so awful. Let's just say this is commercial poetry. But what does he write in the second stanza? I don't believe in saints or omens, early winds, or the pink luck of a sunset. I don't see the Lord's love with her incisions and furry ornaments. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have just taken a turn into true literary poetry. We're no longer quite sure about who the speaker is, who the driver is. But what about the Lord's love with her incisions? Okay, so we've got a female Lord God. What are these incisions? And how bizarre that they're paired with furry ornaments. Okay, so let's look at the third stanza. The vehicle is not just a way to get to the crime, but somehow to bless whatever the journey needs. So now there's a statement, it's a statement of fact that we're meant to believe that about the vehicle, and this is sounding meta, and again, okay, the vehicle, it could be talking about the poem, it could be talking about the taxi, or anything really, literary poetry. I use my braking and steering inputs to turn inward or even to go down the uncertain road. The uncertain road, we're not in Robert Frost territory where it's the road not taken and you pretty much at least think you know what's in the beginning, middle, end of the book. Oh no. And each one of these prose poems does that, and this is what makes it, to me, the most incredible book. It invites you in, and then it alerts you to the fact that it's doing some surprising things, but please don't leave because it's going to intrigue you more and more. And it really does. So this is where I've been this week. This is what I'm thinking about. And I'm still planning to do that prose poetry video. But that's it for now. Okay? I hope you're doing well. Thank you for visiting me again. Thank you so much to a few new subscribers I've had, which I appreciate. You have no idea. Thank you to those who have commented from the bottom of my heart. It means so much to me. Really warms my heart. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.